Welcome to the Creating Kindness Design Team Video Hop. My name's Cheryl Miller and today we're exploring mixed media. Mixed media is where a project uses more than one different medium, and my project today certainly covers that. It's a mishmash of different mediums. I'm starting with some Whisper White thick cardstock. This is half an A4 sheet and a bottle of Liquitex gesso. Now gesso comes in many brands and many consistencies. The Liquitex gesso is quite thin, and I'm just going to apply it with a very large dry paintbrush in a thin layer over the top of the Whisper White cardstock. This just gives the Whisper White some extra tooth and also means that the mediums that I'm going to apply, which are quite wet, won't saturate the card and maybe make it prone to tearing. You'll either need to set this aside to dry or dry it off with a heat tool. Step is to apply some rubbing alcohol spritzers. Now, Isocol is the brand we get in Australia from our supermarkets and chemists. It's got a nifty little hole which makes it easy to get into the spritzer. I've got both halves of my A4 cardstock gessoed up, and I'm going to be using some Bermuda Bay and rich raspberry alcohol spritzers. On the second sheet I'll do two different colours. I've got Lemon Lime Twist and Tranquil Tide. Now, when you're filling these, the top just screws off and you can put 20 to 30 drops of re-inker depending on how strong you want your spritzer, then fill it up with rubbing alcohol and give it a shake. The rubbing alcohol just makes it a lot quicker to dry than if you were going to use straight water. You'll also need lots of paper towel. Now normally I would spritz this in a box, but because that will cut my light out, I'm just doing it on my craft table, on a craft sheet. And I'm just placing some paper towel around the piece so I don't cover everything around me in spritzer. So we'll start with the rich raspberry. Make sure that the nozzle is pointing towards your piece and just give it a couple of squirts. Now because I've got the gesso down, you'll see that instead of soaking into the card, the rubbing alcohol is reacting with the gesso, making little pools, and then where the two colours meet, they'll also make little pools. This is fairly typical of anything with alcohol in it. You can see that some of the gessoed pieces are resisting the ink for some reason. I'm not sure why. It definitely hasn't soaked through the paper, which it probably would have done had I not gessoed the paper. So I'm going to just add a couple more spritzers. We're not using the whole sheet, we're only using part of the sheet, so I do want to make sure that I can pick up some of both of the colours no matter where I cut my eventual background from. I'm just trying to cover that, but it's not going to, it's still resisting. So I've got quite a bit of colour on there now, so I will have to set that aside to dry or dry it with a heat tool. So I'll just pop it over here, clean off my craft mat, and we'll do the other colours. So first we'll start with Lemon Lime Twist. You can see I'm holding the spritzer up quite high. It's about 20 to 30 centimetres away from the piece. The Tranquil Tide looks brilliant, and look at that beautiful reaction with the Lemon Lime Twist and the Tranquil Tide. It's just gorgeous. So I'll add just a couple more spritzers. There's a couple of sort of very light spots in there, so I'll just try and mix the colours together a little bit more, and then I'll decide which one I'm going to use in my piece. You can see there's quite a few blotches and marks, but most of those will be covered over once we add the extra elements. Now these were the finished pieces, and you can see once they're dried they've faded back quite a bit. They're nothing like the original colour. That seems to be a quality of the gesso. I'm going to use the Bermuda Bay and rich raspberry. I'm pulling in some texture stamps to stamp over the top. I've got Timeless Textures, Burlap, and the new one called Gallery Grunge. We're also going to be using StazOn ink because that is waterproof. So when we add extra ink over the top, it's not going to run. Now this is this sort of floorboard chevron type image. That's already got a fairly non-distinct edge, so I can put that one on a block. Just make sure it's straight, and then ink it up with the StazOn. I do like to stamp on some scrap paper just to give me a little bit of cushioning. I'm just going to stamp this randomly around the background piece. I'm giving it a fair amount of pressure because I'm not going to be able to stamp this over the top. being a rubber stamp. And then when I stamp the next one, I'll choose a different orientation, and it really doesn't matter where you put these. Remember, we're not going to be using the whole piece. We are going to cut a smaller piece out of the background. I think it just needs one more. When I do cut, I want to have some of every element across the page so that no matter where I cut from, those elements will all show. So that should be enough. We're going to add quite a few different pieces of texture. This is the burlap stamp. Now it's got quite a distinct edge, which I don't want. So I'm not going to use a block for this one. I'm just going to ink up the middle section and then just press it down quite firmly, but without the block. Now you can see that little bit of texture in the background there. So we'll do that again for another section. Give it a bit of pressure. And there, that's a little bit more distinct. And so now we're going to go around with this stamp, and we're also going to use the sort of circle image stamp from this from the Gallery Grunge set as well. That's going to be a little bit darker, so that's going to be much more distinctly black. I'll pop that on a block, and we're going to put that around the piece as well. So we'll do one here, and then I'll jump ahead to the next section of the video. Oh, that's nice and dark. So I've stamped that one a few times around the piece, and we're going to move on now to the next layer, which will be adding some colour with stenciling. So I'm using the diamond shape or ladder shape from the Pattern Party Decorative Masks and Rich Razzleberry ink. So I'm going to add some more intense colour with the sponge dauber in the centre section, and then I will feather that out with the regular piece of sponge around the edges. So just keep adding bits of the Rich Razzleberry colour with the stencil around the piece. We'll move on to the next section, which we'll be using another mask from that same set. This is a medallion shape, so it's going to give us a little bit more of a circular or curved element to our design. So we won't use the whole stencil, we'll just use parts of it, and I'm going to sponge this one in the other colour, Bermuda Bay. So I'm just using, again, I'll use a combination of sponge and sponge dauber to get some different elements into the background. And that's just highlighting that blue in a slightly darker shade. So again, just move around the piece and add some sections of this stencil wherever you like. And this is what it looks like when it's finished. Now I sort of thought it might need some other colour to lift it in here, so I'm going to use a little bit of lemon lime twist and this small chevron type pattern from the Gallery Grunge. I'm not sure how it's going to look, so I'm just going to try it over here in the corner first. This probably wouldn't be a part I would use. Now you can probably hardly see that. Can you just see that there? And I don't think it's going to be too bad. It's very unobtrusive, and it will just add a little bit of extra different colour in the background. So you can just see that. And I'll just put a few little bits of green around the place. So that's finished off those little lemon lime twist pieces, and we'll move on now to adding some embossing paste. So I'm going to use the brick stencil, which also comes from the Pattern Party Decorative Masks. So I'm just going to use a little tiny bit in a couple of areas on the background. Swipe it across. I don't want the square edges, so I'm leaving those edges be fairly random. It means that some of the bricks won't be solid. That doesn't matter. And I've added another piece on the other side in the same manner. That will need to dry, and you will see that once it's dried back, it's nowhere near as white. It's actually picked up the colours from the dye inks underneath. So it's quite subtle. So now I need a little bit more white, some actually more intense white on my piece, because the bricks are very faded back. So I'm taking some re-inker from my craft white ink pad, and I'm spritzing it with a little bit of water just to make it very runny. I've got a long paintbrush here, so we'll mix that together, and then I'm going to use that paintbrush to flick some speckles of white all over the piece. Now they look quite bright now, but because it's a liquid going over those dye inks that I stenciled on, they will pick up those colours and fade back a little bit. So this was my end result. I added some more white dots, and now I'm going to choose which part of the background I'm going to use on my card front. So I've actually cut a stencil with the shape of the card front so that I can move it around and get an indication of which area I would prefer to use on my card front. I am going to be using the hot air balloon stamp on the front of my card, so I took that into account when I cut the piece that I'm going to use, which ended up being this piece here. The balloon will sit about here, and I've decided to use the thanks for lifting me up greeting as well. So both of these, the balloon and the greeting, will be cut out of the excess pieces of background. So I need to find where they're going to stamp, not over the texture paste obviously. So whatever flat bits of background we've got left, we'll take the balloon and the greeting. So I think I'll take the balloon out of this piece here, that's flat, and I'll set it up on the Stamparatus, put my magnet down, lift up the stamp. Some of my white dots aren't quite dry, I'll just rub those off, and stamp with the, ink it up with the StazOn ink. Now this likely won't stamp exactly right. I don't want to move that piece underneath, so just gently ease it up. And yet it will need to be a little darker. So I'll ink that up again and stamp that down over the top. And that's much darker. So now I've got my background piece, I've got the piece that I've got the balloon, which I'm going to cut out. So that's going to sit about there. You can see it is a little bit lighter in colour, so it should stand out reasonably well over the top of my background. However, I'm thinking I would like it to stand out a little bit more, so I'm going to use up that white craft ink with the water mixed in that I had sitting in my palette by adding a couple of drops of the Bermuda Bay re-inker, mix it all together, and I'm going to paint my balloon with this mixture. So that's just with my regular paintbrush, it's quite fine. Just going to go over the, not the black bits, but the other bits and add the colour. Now, the beauty of using this craft re-inker and going over the background is where the StazOn has been stamped will show through. This will fade back, and where the StazOn has been stamped underneath will show through. So it's not going to be that flat blue colour. It will have a little bit of the pattern in the background. So here it is once it's done and finished, and you can see it's already fading back, and you can see some of that pattern where I've coloured. I'm going to fussy cut that. There is a die for it, but honestly it's such a simple image to fussy cut, I'm just going to quickly fussy cut that out. Now I want my balloon to sit on some clouds, which I'm going to use that final mask out of the Pattern Party decorative masks and more embossing paste. Now I want these clouds to be quite thick because I don't want them to pick up the dye ink from underneath. I want them to stay quite white. So the solution to that is to make them quite thick and textured, and then the dye ink won't be able to soak through. So I'll do three of the little clouds all close together, and they're all different sizes, which is great. So just apply that texture paste, and then once you lift it up, you've got some nice white clouds. Now I notice there's a big blotch of white next to one of those clouds, which is probably some of my white dots that weren't dry and I've smudged. So I am going to position my balloon so it covers that. At the moment I'm putting some white gel pen on the little decorations to highlight them. I'll also fill in some other bits on the balloon with the white gel pen. This is the Signo white gel pen that Stampin' Up used to sell, but I'm not sure if they actually sell it anymore. I don't know if it's in the new catalogue. I'll have to have a look. But anyway, once you get a white gel pen that works well, keep it. So that's going to sit down over here. I'll position this somehow so that I can cover up that blotch. The words are going to come out of the other piece. I've got a nice light piece which doesn't have any black on it, so the words should stand out quite nicely. And that's done well. I'll just cut those out with my scissors, and I'm going to cut each word individually. So I'll just cut that up into bits. And then we'll be ready to put the card together. So I'm going to layer this background piece onto a panel of black card, and then that will be layered onto a Whisper White folded card. So I've just adhered those with multi-purpose liquid glue. The balloon's going to sit over the top of the clouds, and I will mount that up with some dimensionals. So I've just used 4 big ones. I don't have any little ones here with me, so I'm just cutting a piece off the edge of the large dimensionals. And remove the backs, and that will sit nicely over the top of these clouds. I'll just position that so we're covering up most of that blotch that I made. Down here, looks good. And then the words are going to be glued on with multi-purpose liquid glue, just down around the bottom part of the balloon. So I'll position them first, so I know exactly where they're going to go, and then I'll just glue those down with just a little tiny dot of the multi-purpose liquid glue. So once they're all glued down, we're pretty much ready to go. I just thought that the words needed a little bit more highlighting, so I've taken a blender pen. Now I have a blender pen that I set aside specifically to use with white craft ink, because it's difficult to use with anything else, and I'm just going around the edges of each word and then smudging it a little bit with my finger to make sure that it hasn't gone over any of the actual words. And that just highlights those words a little bit, and that's my finished card. So this is a lot of fun. It's messy, it's random, it's sort of make it up as you go along, but as long as you remember to use a permanent ink like StazOn or archival black when you don't want the ink to move, and wherever you use a dye ink, remember that anything you put liquid over the top, it's going to seep into. Don't forget to hop around and see what everyone else has done. Links to all the videos will be underneath this one.